Well, hello friends, and welcome to Ask Zach. Today we're going to talk about one of the most important country albums of all time. It went #1 on the country charts. It spearheaded the neo-traditionalist movement of the early 1980s, coming out of the urban cowboy period. It's Ricky Skaggs' album Highways Heartaches, released in September of 1982, and it had 3 #1 hits and a #2, its 4th single. An amazing record, and we're going to talk about the making of it and the significance of it, and we're going to talk about the instrument that Ricky is holding on the inside of the album, which is a Glaser Mandocaster, which is a 5-string electric mandolin with a bender on it. Oh my goodness, this thing's crazy, and I have to thank, of course, my friend that let me borrow it. But this was an instrument specifically made by Joe Glaser for Ricky to use, and he solos like crazy on it on one of the tracks. So that's today's topic. Ricky Skaggs, Highways and Heartaches. First off, I need to thank my Patreon members. If you'd like to join them in supporting me, there's a link in the description. Also, there is tip jar information, and there is merch, t-shirts and coffee mugs and such. Also, I always appreciate it if you just hit the thumbs up. All right, let's dive in. So first off, we need to give kind of the nickel version of the Ricky Skaggs story. Of course, he grew up in Kentucky, was a bluegrass prodigy, played with quite a few different, big name bands, and he kind of started moving toward a hybrid of country and kind of rockabilly, bluegrass and such with a band he had called Boone Creek that featured Jerry Douglas on dobro, and for a short time had Vince Gill also in the band. He then went on to play with Emmylou Harris and the Hot Band. He was brought in to replace Rodney Crowell. So this was kind of like the Mark 1.A1 or whatever you want to call it version of the Hot Band, where James Burton had left and had been replaced by Albert Lee, and then of course Rodney Crowell, an original Hot Band member, had left and was being replaced by Ricky. So Ricky had a huge effect on the Hot Band, and the Hot Band had a huge effect on Ricky. So Ricky, of course, brought the bluegrass instrumentation and kind of the tunes and his harmony singing and his instrumental prowess, great fiddle playing, mandolin playing, acoustic guitar work. And the Hot Band taught him about electric instruments, using amplifiers, everything being mic'd up. You're getting to play with one of the best bands on the planet. These were guys that played both on the records and toured with Emmy. And so you had, John Ware on drums, Emory Gordy Jr. on bass, Glendy Harden on piano, Albert Lee playing guitar, Hank DeVito on steel. And all those guys were all very obsessed with music, and they were all sharing tunes with each other, and they were making up little, I guess what you'd call mixtapes and such. And they were, passing stuff around and having fun with it. Well, Ricky decides to make a solo record, and he does, and it was for the Sugar Hill label, and it was called Sweet Temptation, and it has some help from some of the Hot Band guys, and it's a great album. It has Albert Lee, also has Buddy Emmons guesting on steel on a number of cuts, and it's kind of an interesting album in that the tunes tend to be either bluegrass or country. He hasn't really gotten into his hybrid music yet that we're going to get to. He decides to make a second album. I guess he has a 2-record deal with Sugar Hill, and he starts making the second one with the Hot Band. And so, you've got Albert Lee and John Ware, again, all these cats, playing on this album with him. And he's on a flight, and he's listening to Ruffs, and he happens to be bumped up to first class, and he's sitting next to a guy that ends up being a bigwig at A&M Records. And Ricky, puts his headphones on the other guy's, head. Well, because he asks, he wants to hear it. And he says, you really need to, go to Nashville. You need to get on a major label. He ends up meeting with a couple of labels that pass, but they send him to Rick Blackburn with Epic, which was part of CBS Records, which later became part of Sony. And they sign him. And it's all based on these tracks that Ricky cut with the Hot Band. Unfortunately, they're owned by Sugar Hill. And so without there being negotiations and money changing hands, they can't release the tracks. So they send Ricky into the studio to cut a record. Now, Ricky wants to produce it because, of course, he produced Sweet Temptation and also the tracks he did with the Hot Band, but the label is a little bit hesitant with that, but they agree to it. And so they bring in a producer / engineer named Marshall Morgan to help out, just as someone that has a ton of experience as an engineer and also has production experience as a producer. So just to give you a little bit of information about Marshall, worked for the Eagles. He was a tech out on the road, and but he also worked with them in the studio and learned a lot from watching Eagles producers and watching how they cut tape and cut tracks and all sorts of different aspects of the recording process. And Marshall learned about cutting tape, which the Eagles were notorious for cutting and splicing tape. And so that's where Marshall Morgan learned how to do that. So Marshall is brought in, and they cut Ricky's first album for Epic called Waitin' for the Sun to Shine. And it features a mix of studio guys and some cats that Ricky had found that he wanted to be part of his band. One of them, probably most importantly, is a wonderful guitar player named Ray Flacke. So Ray Flacke is a British guitar player, and Ricky met him in the UK. So Ray was auditioning. He was supposed to audition for Emmylou to potentially replace Albert Lee in the Hot Band, because Albert was going to leave to push his solo record. But of course, Albert ends up, instead of going out on tour to promote his solo album, he goes out on the road with Eric Clapton and does world tours for the next 4 or 5 years. So Emmy and the Hot Band show up in the UK. They're late, and Ray is sitting around playing guitar, and everyone else is madly setting their stuff up, not paying any attention to Ray Flacke. But Ricky Skaggs pays attention to this guy, and he realizes that this guy is a really, really amazing soloist and telly guy, and he's the perfect guy for Ricky's version of the Hot Band, which he's about to put together. So fast forward back to Waitin' for the Sun to Shine. Well, Ricky's got Ray Flacke in tow as his Albert Lee. And that's not to in any way reduce Ray's influence or his playing or his importance on this album. It was just, that was the kind of the role he was playing. There are great songs on there. There's Don't Get Above Your Raisin and some other tunes. But the songs that go to number one are, slower tunes. And so they're Crying My Heart Out Over You and I Don't Care, which are great songs, but they're not really picking songs. They're not really this bluegrass hybrid thing yet. You kind of get a taste of it with Don't Get Above Your Raisin and some of the other tunes off the album, but we're not there yet. So at this point, there's a sense that maybe they were trying to negotiate to use those Hot Band tracks that Sugar Hill owned, but instead they go in again and cut another record. And so this album ends up being Highways and Heartaches. Again, Marshall Morgan is mixing and recording it, and Ricky is producing it, and you have an interesting mix of his live band on certain tracks, and then certain tracks have studio cats. So his live band at the time had Mickey Merritt on piano, had Ray Flacke on guitar, you had Rodney Price on drums, you had Jesse Chambers on bass, Bruce Boughton on steel, and you had Bobby Hicks playing fiddle. And then on the more studio player tracks, you would have Jerry Kroon playing drums, and you'd have the amazing Wrecking Crew bass player Joe Osborn. And so it's here we need to just kind of give credit for the amazing influence that Joe Osborn had on Ricky Skaggs' bass sound. The sound that you hear on the Skaggs records through the years, and the way his following bass players live and in the studio kind of do things. And Ricky kind of tends to become a fan of guys that use a jazz bass with flat wound strings and play with a flat pick. And so that was the way Joe Osborn played, and that's the way Jesse Chambers played, and the ensuing bass players that played electric in his band. You have so there's tracks that have the live band. Interestingly enough, the tracks that feature the live band end up being the majority of the #1 hits on there, which is just funny because those tunes were harder to cut, because as good as those live players are, they're not used to being in the studio every day, and so it just takes longer to do it. Again, not that they didn't do a great job, it just takes longer to cut tracks when you're dealing with road players versus session players that are in the studio day in and day out. So just some of the tunes that are off here. The opening track is Heartbroke, which is a Guy Clark tune, which has an amazing Ray Flacke solo. It ends up going to #1. It's and on this, I don't know for sure on all this, but Marshall Morgan indicated to me that many times, because Ricky liked to splice tape, he would get Ray Flacke to take multiple passes at a solo, and then they would piece it together. Not that any of the solos were bad or had any mistakes in it, but every attempt was very different, and they would piece together the best pieces from each one to get the most fiery, over-the-top guitar solo they could get out of Ray. And from that, I know this is true also because of interviewing Ray Flacke, where he said, I didn't play that. And what it is that, again, it was like multiple takes of him improvising, and then you piece it together in a way that's like, well, I didn't play those things together. So, and they sounded really good on the album, but it became frustrating, for Ray, because all of a sudden he was trying to piece together, 4 different solos that he played. And all of a sudden you've got to play something where it sounded right, but it didn't make sense on the guitar to go from one lick to another. So you get some really amazing solos though. Let's see, what else about Heartbroke? Just a great, country tune. It was also cut by George Strait, but of course, Skaggs had the hit with it. The next song on the album is You've Got a Lover, which was another single, and it was the only one that went only to #2. So, and You've Got a Lover is featuring the studio cats. So it's got Jerry Kroon playing drums, it's got, Joe Osborn playing bass, and you have a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful steel guitar solo by the great Lloyd Green. One of his best solos of all time. I love what he did on that. Then one of the other interesting tracks is another one of the singles that went #1 is called I Wouldn't Change You If I Could. And on that tune, it's interesting because Ray Flacke is not playing on that cut, and Ricky is playing electric guitar, and he's using a B-bender. So this is the first example of Ricky playing electric B-bender Telecaster. And he plays some really nice fills on the tune. It's kind of a mid-tempo tune, and he's kind of like neck pickup or both pickup kind of sound. It's more of your kind of laid back bendery kind of stuff that Albert was very adept at doing, but it's actually, of course, Ricky. Then you have Can't You Hear Me Callin', which is another bluegrass tune where we're getting into this hybrid sound where they're really kind of honing in on it. They're really kind of, you've got this this old bluegrass tune that, of course, starts off with the fiddle lick and just has some really great picking on it and such. Then we get to the next #1 song off the album, which is Highway 40 Blues, which was, of course, a huge hit. It's a perennial. And this is another one where you've cemented the hybrid sound. The country, bluegrass, rockabilly thing has really been brought into focus here. Amazing solos by Ricky on acoustic mandolin. You have great, banjo playing by Ray Flacke. You have the great, steel solo by, Bruce Boughton, and great guitar solos by Ray Flacke. Really wonderful tune. Great, opening lick, harmony lick between the steel and the electric guitar. The album closes with a tune that is just an excuse to take a bunch of solos. And it's a Rodney Crowell tune called One Way Rider. And it clocks in at 5 minutes, 27 seconds long. And that's because this is the live band, the road band, getting to stretch out. And so you get great solos by Ray Flacke and Bruce Boughton, and you get fiddle solos by Bobby Hicks and such. And you get some amazing playing by Ricky on a Glaser Mandocaster. So this was an instrument that Joe Glaser specifically made and designed for Ricky Skaggs. This is an emblem of what Ricky was doing. This instrument is a mix of bluegrass, country, and rockabilly. It's a mandolin, but it only has single course. It doesn't have double courses like a regular acoustic mandolin, and it has a low C on it. Also, of course, it's solid body, and then it's got a bender on its second string, which of course in this case is an A, so it's an A bender instead of a B bender. And this is just an amazingly cool instrument. So much of this is completely handmade by Joe, because none of these things, you couldn't order any of this stuff. The body is, a sandwich of at least 2 pieces of wood. You can see this line here. You can see that this is a homemade, control plate. These are homemade knobs. This has a little 3-way switch for the 2 pickups. You have this bridge is completely homemade except for the saddles. The saddles, these are like Mighty Mite, kind of keyhole saddles. You have, I'm sure this is a homemade, bridge plate that had to be chrome plated. You've got homemade, 5-pole, little single coil pickups that sound amazing. You adjust the height just like on a Tele, on a little miniaturized, and on the neck, it has these little screws back here to adjust the height of the neck pickup, kind of like an old Dan Electro or Jerry Jones. Of course, you have the B bender, of course, it's an A bender here. You have the tuning adjustment and the tension adjustment back here. You have a beautiful maple body, maple neck, bird's eye. It's got a truss rod, so of course, he had to make all these things. You've got the Glaser logo on there with Mandocaster, kind of a spaghetti type logo, double string tree, Schaller machine heads, which are, one of the few things on here besides the screws that he was able to just buy. This is an amazing little instrument. So right now, I'm gonna plug her in, and I'm gonna play a little bit of some single note lines, and I'm gonna give you some bender type things, and then I'll give you some tracks using echo. So in Ricky's playing on One Way Rider, a lot of it is just the straight Mandocaster with maybe some slapback delay. But then at the outro of the tune, he turns on an echoplex and uses a dotted 8th note repeat, and he plays some really cool lines that we're kind of used to hearing that stuff from, like, Albert Lee has done it at times, as had John Jorgensen on Orange Blossom Special, the intro to that, or Price I Pay. It's this dotted 8th repeat where the original note is the same volume as the repeat is the same volume as the original note. So I'm gonna play a little bit of that, and then we'll come back here. hope you enjoyed that. Again, this is such a cool little instrument, and I hope to get to talk about these more later. And again, I need to thank Daryl Cole. So thank you. All right. Well, I hope that you will check out Highways and Heartaches, and also I hope you'll listen to Don't Cheat in Our Hometown, which of course is the album that finally came out that had the hot band tracks on it. So finally, they CBS Epic made a deal with Sugar Hill, and they were able to release it. And it was a big album for Ricky. It had Honey Won't You Open That Door and Uncle Pen on it. And so it's interesting because on Don't Cheat in Our Hometown, some of the tunes were cut in the 70s with the hot band, and some were cut in the early 80s with his road band. So you've got like Uncle Pen that has his road band, Ray Flacke, and then you have, Honey Won't You Open That Door that has, the hot band and Albert Lee, playing B-bender guitar. And it's a really great album also. So I hope you'll listen to some old Ricky Skaggs and just understand, one, it's just a great album on its own, but then when you put it in the context of what was going on at the time in country music and just how kind of pop crossover, kind of heavily, pop influence, and, it was, people wanted to make money. I mean, who cares? I mean, yeah. But this album was a big deal. Highways and Heartaches was a huge deal. It was a #1 album, had 3 number 1s and a #2 single. That's a lot. When an album has that many, hit singles on it, it's a big deal. So go listen to it, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.